Now we also have the state factor of time, and time is another critical component of soils. So many soil forming processes occur very slowly, so the time over which soils develop influences their properties. Some of these processes are very slow. And the authors show here is an example of the phosphorus content of soils. And in general, when you take a look at the phosphorus content of soils, phosphorus content tends to go down over time. But there's other things that occur that generate differences in the form of phosphorus. There's primary phosphorus, occluded phosphorus, secondary, and organic phosphorus. And because of all the reactions going on with phosphorus over time, that availability of phosphorus is going to change non-linearly over time. So the authors say that the effects of long-term weathering and soil development on the distribution and availability of phosphorus. Newly exposed geologic substrate is relatively rich in phosphorus, and so that's what we have here when we're low on the time axis. And the release leads to accumulation of both organic and readily soluble forms. So the highest amount of organic we have, of organic phosphorus, happens at intermediate time scales. Then as time goes on, a lot of that phosphorus gets transferred to occluded forms and relatively non-available forms for the phosphorus that's left in the system. And so if we have a relatively young soil, it's going to have a lot of available phosphorus, either in primary or organic forms, for example. And then as time goes on, phosphorus content is going to decline. And so old soils, highly weathered soils, have very little phosphorus left in them. Well, some of those processes are relatively slow, others are pretty fast. So for example, the generation of organic material can be a very fast process, and within, say, 100 years of the primary formation of the soil material, you can build up lots and lots of organic material. So in general, when we're thinking about time, we have to think about processes that are occurring at different scales. Now, the next state factor is biota, and the organisms that are present in a soil have a very large effect on the types of soils that we have, their functioning and their structure. Past and present organisms at a site strongly influence soil chemical and physical properties. So plants, for example, are going to input carbon, and because of their associations with nitrogen fixers, input nitrogen. So plants are really important for putting in carbon and nitrogen into soils. But plants are also geochemical pumps, and they remove some elements from the soil, they store them, and they return them to the soil through litter fall and decomposition. And plants are going to cycle a lot of nutrients and a lot of elements through different components of the ecosystem and redistribute them too. So for example, plants move elements up soil profiles. So if this is the soil surface and you have your plant at the top of there, its roots are going to extend pretty deep. And at the bottom of a soil profile, it can take elements up and cycle them, release them at the top of the soil, bring them into leaves, and then through litter fall, deposit them at the top of the soil surface. And so in that case, although we have some processes like precipitation and water movement that are going to bring materials downward, plants are going to bring them back up to the top of the surface. One of the things to think about too is how we determine those species effects. And in general, what we do, one way to start to understand how different plant species impact soils is to set up monocultures. And so there'll be experiments, for example, that I'll have a plot with one species and compare that to a plot with another. And the changes in the soil properties over time associated with those two species give a good indication of what different species do to soils. In addition to plants, animals also influence soils. So for example, if you go into relatively tropical areas, often relatively wet grasslands, you'll get a lot of termites, and those termites do a lot of different things, but they're going to move and concentrate elements and materials in the termite mounds, and that's a soil forming process. Other animals have other effects. So bison, for example, that we'll study, will wallow in the ground, and that creates bare areas and redistributes material. But in addition, they often tend to move elements around too, and where their patterns, depending on their patterns of urination or defecation, that's going to move and concentrate materials. So bison, for example, tend to urinate in their wallows, and that concentrates salts. And salts have a couple of different effects, but one of the things it does is deflocculate clays. So it makes those clays kind of spread out and turn into an impermeable layer. So we have soils in Kansas, for example, that have been determined by bison, and we have a special soil series that's basically old bison wallows like this. They're relatively impermeable, form small ponds, and they dot the landscape, even in places where bison haven't been for over 100 years. Now, the other state factor that Hans Jenny talked about, if you remember, that sixth state factor, were humans. And over the past 40 years, the doubling of human population and associated agricultural and industrial activities have strongly influenced soil development worldwide. Now, when we think about Hans Jenny and his categorization of the state factors, the human state factor didn't really come along till late. And when he started to take a look at soils, essentially, what he realized is that there were a whole bunch of soils that he could describe that only could be understood through human activities. And one of the most important activities was tillage. So this here is a photograph of a competition that we had attended in Vermont. And essentially, it was a plowing competition where people would come and they would bring their horses or their mules or their oxen and use the same tools that would have been used 200 years ago to till soils. And the competition itself was to see who could till the longest and straightest rows using just their animals and a very simple plow. So even in a situation like this, where we had a very simple instrument to till the soils, that these animals could work really fast and they could till soils relatively quickly. And this tillage brings material up, turns it over within the soil, and also has other effects on its structure too. And so all of these areas historically that you'd see in the hillside, often if they were under agriculture, would have been plowed by animals like this in a situation like this, often by men wearing overalls just like this. And so this is something that's been going on for a long time, and a lot of soils in the world bear the imprint of 5 of those state factors, but also the 6th state factor and human effects. Now, in addition to tillage, humans also have another important impact, and that's nutrient inputs. And so they'll take and redistribute elements on a very large scale to change the contents of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, for example. But in addition, there's changes in water availability. We said that temperature and water are really important climate state factors, but humans also redirect water through irrigation. And lastly, there's erosion. And in the next module, we're going to talk about soil loss.